Everyone says the same thing. Factories are leaving China and Vietnam is winning. New factories, new investments, more exports, more headlines. From the outside, it looks obvious. Vietnam rises, China loses. But what if that is not what's happening? What if Vietnam's success is actually helping China? Because after nearly 20 years in international trade, I discovered something most people never see. And once you see it, you look at Vietnam and China very differently. Because this isn't a story about Vietnam replacing China. It is a story about why China may still be winning. Before we continue, you should know where this perspective comes from. My name is Murat. I am originally from Turkey, and I have spent nearly 20 years working in international trade. Today, I live in Bangkok, Thailand. And over the years, I have helped companies source products and work with suppliers across Asia, including China and Vietnam. That is one reason this subject fascinates me, because what's happening in Vietnam today isn't just something I have read about. I have seen parts of it myself, and one experience in particular completely changed the way I think about global manufacturing. I will share that story in a few minutes. But before we continue, if you are interested in manufacturing, sourcing, import-export, and understanding how international business is changing, you are in the right place. That is exactly what we explore on this channel. So consider subscribing. Now let's talk about Vietnam. 20 years ago, very few people were talking about Vietnam. Back then, when people talked about manufacturing in Asia, they talked about China. China was becoming the factory of the world. Vietnam was barely part of the conversation. But over the last 2 decades, something changed. Vietnam started attracting more factories, more investment, more exports, and more attention from global companies. I have visited Vietnam several times over the years, and every time I went back, I noticed the same thing. More factories, more trucks, more warehouses, more industrial parks, more investment. The country was changing fast, and it was hard to miss. Today, Vietnam produces everything from electronics and machinery to furniture, textiles, and consumer products. And those products are shipped all over the world. But here is what makes that story even more impressive. Vietnam has a population of around 100 million people. China has more than 1.4 billion. Yet Vietnam has become one of the most important manufacturing locations in the world. Think about that for a moment. A country of 100 million people is attracting manufacturing investment from some of the world's biggest companies. And that's exactly why investors, manufacturers, and business leaders are paying attention. But that raises an important question. Why Vietnam? Why did so many companies choose Vietnam instead of dozens of other developing countries? The answer is more surprising than most people think. There are several reasons companies choose Vietnam. Lower labor costs, trade agreements, a business-friendly environment, and a location right next to China. But a few years ago, I experienced something that completely changed the way I think about this story. Besides my consulting work, I also a co-founder of a company in the solar industry. And like many businesses, we regularly work with manufacturers across Asia, especially China. A few years ago, we were looking for solar panels and related products. So naturally, we contacted Chinese manufacturers. After all, China dominates the global solar industry. But something unexpected happened. Several Chinese suppliers didn't offer products from factories in China. Instead, they pointed us to factories in Vietnam. At first, I was confused. Why would a Chinese company manufacture in Vietnam? Then I realized what was happening. Many Western countries had started placing additional tariffs on some Chinese products. So for certain manufacturers, producing in Vietnam made a lot of sense. It helped them stay competitive. And that is when something clicked. Many people think factories are leaving China, but in many cases, Chinese companies are simply expanding beyond China. The factory moved, but the owner didn't. Think about that for a moment. The factory moved, but the owner didn't. The company was still Chinese. The management was still Chinese. And much of the supply chain was still connected to China. Only the production location had changed. And once you see that, you are start looking at Vietnam's rise very differently. Because maybe the story isn't Vietnam replacing China. Maybe the story is China adapting. Adapting to a changing world. In recent years, many global companies have adopted something called the China Plus One strategy. Instead of relying entirely on China, they keep part of their production there, while expanding into countries like Vietnam, India, Thailand, Turkey, and Mexico. And interestingly, many Chinese manufacturers are doing something very similar. They are not necessarily leaving China. They are expanding beyond China. And that may be one of the biggest reasons Vietnam has grown so quickly. At this point, you might be wondering, why Vietnam? Why not Indonesia? Why not Bangladesh? Why not the Philippines? Or dozens of other emerging economies? Most people immediately point to lower labor costs. And yes, labor costs matter, but I don't think that is Vietnam's biggest advantage. In fact, Vietnam's biggest advantage may be something much simpler: geography. Because Vietnam sits right next to the largest manufacturing ecosystem on Earth, China, and that changes everything. Imagine you are a manufacturer. You have spent years building supplier relationships. You know the factories, you know the logistics, you know how the system works. Would you rather move thousands of miles away and start over from scratch, or move next door and stay connected to everything you have already built? For many companies, the answer is obvious. That is one reason Vietnam became so attractive. Not because it was replacing China, but because it could work alongside China. And there is another misconception I hear all the time. Many people assume moving production to Vietnam automatically means lower costs. But that is not always true. I have seen this myself. Through our solar business, we have sourced products from both Chinese and Vietnamese factories. And when we compared solar panel quotations, something surprised me. The Vietnamese factory wasn't cheaper. In some cases, when we calculated the price on a per watt basis, the Vietnamese quote was actually higher. Think about that for a moment. A lot of people assume companies move to Vietnam because it is cheaper. But cost is only part of the story. Companies are also thinking about tariffs, supply chain security, diversification, and reducing dependence on a single country. In other words, they are not always choosing the cheapest option. Sometimes they are choosing the safer and smarter option. And this is where many people get the story wrong. Vietnam's rise and China's success are not necessarily opposites. In many cases, they are connected. Many factories in Vietnam still rely on machinery, components, raw materials, and supplier networks linked to China. That is one reason Vietnam was able to grow so quickly. It didn't have to build everything from zero. In many ways, it was able to plug into an ecosystem that already existed. And that's a huge advantage. Because building a factory is hard, but building an entire manufacturing ecosystem is much harder. And that brings us to the biggest question of all. Can Vietnam really become the next China? So, can Vietnam become the next China? Maybe. But I think that is the wrong question. A better question is this: can Vietnam build what made China so powerful in the first place? Because when most people think about manufacturing, they think about factories. But factories are only one piece of the puzzle. Behind every factory, there are suppliers, raw materials, machines, engineers, ports, roads, logistic companies, research centers, and entire cities built around manufacturing. That is what China spent decades building. And that is where the real challenge begins. Vietnam can build factories. Many countries can. But building an entire manufacturing ecosystem, that is completely different challenge. Think about it. A factory can move, but thousands of suppliers don't move so easily. A factory can be built in a year. An ecosystem can take decades. And that is something many people underestimate. When people talk about replacing China, they usually focus on factories. But factories are only the visible part. The real advantage is everything behind them. The suppliers, the infrastructure, the experience, the networks. And that is why I don't think the future is about Vietnam replacing China. I think the future is about Vietnam becoming a bigger part of the global manufacturing system, alongside China, not instead of China. Because in many ways, Vietnam's rise has been supported by an ecosystem that China spent decades building. And that creates a very different picture, one where Vietnam grows, and China still plays a major role. So after everything we have discussed, who is really winning? Is it Vietnam? Is it China? Or is it someone else entirely? I think the answer is more complicated than most people realize. Vietnam is winning. The country is attracting investment, creating jobs, and becoming more important every year. But China is winning too, because many Chinese companies aren't standing still. They are adapting, expanding, and building production networks far beyond China's borders. And then there are the global companies. They may be the biggest winner of all, because they gain something every business wants. More flexibility, more resilience, and more options. So maybe the real story isn't Vietnam versus China. Maybe the real story is how global manufacturing is changing. Vietnam is rising, China is adapting, and the companies that understand that shift early may have the biggest advantage of all. That is one reason I started this channel. After nearly 20 years in international trade, I have learned that the biggest opportunities often appear long before they become obvious. And that is exactly what we will explore here. Manufacturing, sourcing, global trade, and the countries shaping the future of business. So, if that sounds interesting, consider subscribing. And if you are an importer, distributor, business owner, or entrepreneur looking for sourcing support, supplier verification, or international trade consulting across Asia or other parts of the world, you will find my contact details below. Now, I would love to hear your opinion. Can Vietnam become the next China? Or is China simply expanding through Vietnam? Let me know in the comments. I am looking forward to reading your thoughts. I will see you in the next. Take care. Bye bye.